So this video is going to give you 5 signs you might actually be an ESTJ. And I have to say I've been looking forward to making this video, and I've very much been saving the best in this series till last. The ESTJ is probably the least understood type out of all of the 16 types. And it's definitely the most misrepresented. And I gotta say, the stereotypes do not help. The idea of the ESTJ being this kind of sentinel, guardian of tradition, a stickler for the rules, when so oftentimes ESTJs are the complete opposite of the stereotype they are often portrayed to be. And this causes a host of mistyping. I'd say the 3 most common types for ESTJ to mistype into are INTP, ENTP, and INTJ. INTP and ENTP due to the rightful recognition the individual would have of their extremely strong extroverted intuition constrained to a more logical agenda. And INTJ because of the whole mastermind thing that gets thrown around the internet. This video is actually going to explain the ESTJ cognition in more depth and hopefully give a proper representation of how this type may actually be the true mastermind out of them all. So let's begin with sign number 1 that you might be an ESTJ, task-centric extraversion. So a lot of ESTJs rightfully type as introverts because they don't see themselves as necessarily particularly sociable people. They may even find in social situations they might clam up a bit, become a bit more private, and would tend to find more energy drained through that kind of interaction. And this is all perfectly normal for the default variant of this type. Extroverted thinking dominants in general are generally more inclined towards task-oriented extroversion rather than sociability type extroversion. And this form of extroversion gets pretty much completely overlooked within the literature. You might refer to extroversion definitions talking about gaining energy from something. Well, ESTJs, while their energy may be drained from engaging with people on a social basis, they actually find they get a lot of energy back from engaging with their task-oriented world. When they're completing their projects, for example, when they're in the flow state of researching all kinds of different things. This type may actually find themselves very energetic. Oftentimes this type has a lot of capacity to entertain lots of different projects and ideas and responsibilities over the course of a single week. And this is a form of extroversion. As with the CPT definition of extroversion, the ESTJ's cognition is primarily more reactive than proactive. This does not mean it is either one or the other, but there'll be a majority of cognition devoted more to the former than the latter. What does this mean? Well, a reactive cognition is essentially one that operates more as an extension of an external medium. It's going to be more associated with the task-positive network of the brain rather than their default mode network. So while ESTJs will have lots of introspection, lots of original thoughts and so on, generally their cognition is oriented more towards an external interaction. And so that means when they're autonomous from an external interaction, the cognition they still have is going to be primarily anticipating a future interaction, thinking about things that they could do, for example. Now, I don't want to misrepresent this type as just doing all the time, but the task-oriented extroversion is still a very important factor to bear in mind when you're considering the ways in which this type is extroverted. So if you find yourself deeply immersed in your projects and find yourself devoting a lot of time and energy every week to their ongoing completion, you may very well be an ESTJ. So now let's move on to sign number 2 that you might be an ESTJ. Extroverted thinking, extroverted intuitive ecosystems. So when these 2 cognitive functions or cognitive elements that's within CPT pair up, so extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition, they actually create a unique cognitive pairing that has less to do with specific outcomes and specific goals, and much more to do with maintaining a kind of ecosystem around the self that may come with its myriad responsibilities and so on. In many ways, the ESTJ is much more likened to a gardener than they are necessarily a force of will. And it's so interesting how extroverted thinking, which is oftentimes regarded as a cold, calculating, goal-oriented, self-serving function in many ways, in this case, and still many others, is much more to do with and manifesting as a kind of nurturing, caring, and protective role. Oftentimes extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition, because this is extroverted thinking, an inter-objective frameworking, external element, assigned to a much more broad scope of extroverted intuition, is going to be much more interested in maintaining and nurturing and growing the world around it, because the scope of extroverted thinking here is just so much more broad. Whereas an ENTJ, with their extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing, is going to have this kind of tunnel vision as they're pursuing these goals and trying to kind of transmute reality around them. ESTJ's extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition, dominant pairing is going to be assimilating myriad different parts together in order to kind of help things thrive in synergistic union. Harmony is actually a huge value of this type, and harmony extends to so much more than just where the two people are getting on socially in the moment. TENE dominance seeks to kind of create harmony absolutely everywhere in an absolute kind of sense. It wants everything to be moving and seamlessly integrating in a really beautiful way. Extroverted thinking is still a force of change, so it's still going to be growing this garden and pulling out the weeds, for example. But its proclivity is still much more toward nurturing and maintaining a garden over time and having this beautiful synergistic relationship with the ecosystem around the self than it is knocking out goals 24/7 and completing tasks. These two things aren't mutually exclusive because, of course, an ecosystem requires tasks, but it is not tasks for the sake of tasks, and that's an important distinction to bear in mind. A crude analogy, but one that I kind of like, if you imagine a cruise ship or something like that, an ENTJ might be the captain of the ship. They have that kind of NI vision, they're directing it on a specific path, and they're very much focused on a very select amount of responsibilities in the moment. Whereas if you're thinking about the ESTJ, they may actually be the chief engineer. I don't want to kind of get into the stereotype of every ESTJ as an engineer, because obviously that's nonsense. But in this particular case, the engineer of a ship as opposed to the captain of the ship is a good representation of TENE over TESE. They're responsible for maintaining the ecosystem around them. And their extroverted intuition is so broad that extroverted thinking has a greater host of overall responsibilities and more micromanaging tendencies for that reason. So if you find yourself as more of a yes person, taking on numerous responsibilities in order to maintain and develop and grow over time the world around you, ESTJ may actually be worth considering. This is not a type who shuns responsibilities. And even the myriad ENTP mistyping ESTJs, which might actually be the majority, if they actually look closely at themselves and their overall behavior over time, especially in the past, maybe before they got hurt by saying yes too often, for example, they would generally have more of a tendency to look after the world around them than to kind of isolate themselves away in this kind of mad professor fashion. Sign number 3 that you might be an ESTJ, introverted feeling divergence. So within CPT, when any given cognitive element is in oppositional position, referred to as inferior in other systems, this does not mean it is inherently weaker than, say, something in dominant position. These terms can be misleading. What it actually means here is that introverted feeling is much more observed than it is acted upon. So there's kind of an ease of observing what one needs in this case, but maybe a difficulty compromising on those needs. An ease of understanding what emotions one has, but not necessarily the reasons why one has those emotions. And when you have a type like INFP, for example, which is an ESTJ flipped on its axis, this entire thing will be reversed. The person will have a lot of change potential over their introverted feeling state, and they'll know the reasons why they're feeling a certain way, but actually locking it down and saying, like, this is what I'm feeling right now. This is what I value right now. Because the space is so fluid in dominant position, it's actually a lot harder for such a type than it is for an ESTJ. This means that ESTJs often have a good sense of what they stand for, even if they don't necessarily understand the reasons why. The whole INTJ stereotype that gets thrown around the more pop psychology realm, where, the INTJ gets asked, why do you believe this certain thing? Why is this good? And then they kind of shrug and just say, it just is, these are my values. Well, actually, that's much more of an ESTJ thing than it is an INTJ thing. And another reason why ESTJs would mistype as that type. So divergent functions, as opposed to convergent ones, diverge away from the ego. So they're not within the ego realm. In this case, it means it's more of a force of authority to be acted upon at the behest of than it is a force to be changed and questioned. So when you're trying to understand introverted feeling divergence, especially hyperdivergence as within the TE dominant here, it's important to consider that such introverted feeling is intrinsically more reflexive than it is reflective. What this means is an ESTJ will find themselves reflexively kind of acting upon their own intrinsic needs, sometimes without even realizing what they're doing in the moment. Sometimes hyperdivergent reflexivity is just so compulsive and so natural and so instantaneous that ESTJs might just find themselves naturally acting at the behest of their own needs over time. And reflexive introverted feeling is generally a lot more compulsive and impulsive than convergent, reflective introverted feeling. So if you find yourself naturally attending to your own needs, if you find yourself standing up for your values, even when you don't necessarily even understand why you have these values, ESTJ is definitely a type worth considering. So unless an ESTJ gets kind of trapped within a serving other role, which to be honest does happen quite frequently, you'll often find this type being very firm in their values and convictions. And I do want to get into the serving tendency of this type, but before I do so I want to explore introverted feeling in a little bit more depth. So sign up before that you may actually be an ESTJ pertains to the introverted feeling, introverted sensing pairing in oppositional position. So when introverted feeling pairs to introverted sensing, it creates a more concrete attunement to one's needs than an abstract one. It generally means the process is more additive rather than multiplicative. So essentially a person's looking at the actual building blocks of their feeling processes rather than extrapolating upon what they mean on a grand scale. So as a result, ESTJs tend to be much more attuned to their own fundamental needs as well as those that they relate to, or in some cases project themselves onto. And notice that this introverted sensing auxiliary is also in authority position in this type as well. Authority position introverted sensing tends to have a heavy resource preservational kind of attitude. So this type is not only adept at preserving their own resources, but they're also doing so from the position of attending to their own needs and those that they care about. So the ESTJ is oftentimes going to be the person who's like saving a rainy day fund, for example, bringing a spare tire, bringing a host of different things in case something goes wrong, and that means needs are no longer being satisfied. It's imperative to this type that needs are met. But because this is a codec dominant, which is another CPT face, so essentially the element in oppositional position, so therefore dominant within this pairing of FISI, is rational rather than perceptual. So this means the means of emotion are going to be emphasized. So if you're comparing ENFP versus ESTJ, ENFPs will often be attending to the needs that they might have and will be a little bit more utopian, whereas FISI divergence, so the ESTJ, is going to be much more grounded and kind of pragmatic. It's all saying, well, I don't have every single possible human need met, but I do have the general mean sum, and this is good enough. And one remarkable strength of this type, which also kind of corresponds to their introverted feeling, introverted intuitive blind spot, a kind of ISFP blind spot of this type, is their capacity to accept things as they are and push down the more idealistic nature of humanity that is manifested most in ISFPs. So this FISI over FINI, so ESTJ, for example, versus ENTJ here, is going to manifest in a great attunement to one's own fundamental needs, but a difficulty extrapolating upon those needs sufficiently to be able to form desires and wants in the moments, for example. Oftentimes, the ESTJ is actually less certain about what they might want or what they might desire because they're too busy attending to their own fundamental, basic human needs. And when you ask an ESTJ about what they might desire, it might just be pertaining more to a TE flow state. They just want to be in their ecosystem. They just want harmony. They just want things to be going well, or they want to be riding an exciting wave of invention. Oftentimes, these aren't necessarily going to be true FINI desires. They're just going to be kind of FISI experience of a TE state. They're kind of satiated. This is nice right now. Things are okay. Things are not falling apart. So a good tell between ESTJ and ENTJ, for example, is going to be kind of minimalism versus maximalism. ESTJs are often very good at holding themselves back and saying, well, I don't need this thing, so I'm not going to have this thing. Or these things that I am going to splurge on are going to be things that do enhance my ability to attend to my needs, such as, tools. I don't want to get too stereotypical, but it's still an example of FISI divergence in action. Whereas the maximalist, the kind of more FINI-oriented individual, just talking generally here, is going to be more given towards sort of saying, well, I want the best thing. I want the kind of best experience. I've got exacting standards and I want the next best thing after this. It's all about evolution within FINI. So FISI, survival, FINI, evolution is a really good distinction to have there. So if you're someone who's more on the practical side, or at least highly oriented around your own resources and their effective use, and can easily take on a responsibility for resource management in general, ESTJ might be worth considering. Sign number 5 pertains to the extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing dip, the kind of ENFJ side of the ESTJ. And this is the side of the type's cognition that gets not only overlooked, but I'd say just outright ignored in favor of just kind of boxing them into a simplistic two-dimensional stereotype. In my experience typing ESTJ clients, in my experience knowing ESTJs in real life, and just from the actual theoretical principles of CPT, ESTJs tend to be people who seek long-term, enduring, and incredibly deep human bonds. Extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing is all about focusing one's own extroverted feeling energies into a specific subject and seeking maximal synchronicity between oneself and the other. From the position of the FITE axis, the ESTJ is doing so from a highly relational, introverted feeling center. So this is someone who oftentimes seeks extremely deep bonds with other people. They're constantly looking for that person who they resonate with. They're looking for a way to kind of truly connect to humanity. And this actually creates an overwhelming sense of sensitivity within the type as well, and a kind of a natural idealism when it comes to their relationships with other people. Because they're looking for this kind of resonant factor when interacting with others. They're looking for that kind of person or people who would kind of get them, who would really be on their wavelength and be able to share deep and meaningful experiences with. This can lead to a sense of disappointment. And more than that, it can actually lead to an overwhelming amount of hurt when the type might feel betrayed by someone that they care about, for example. So when really understanding the ESTJ and sometimes their more negative manifestations later in life, it's really important to take a compassionate perspective, look at the extreme sensitivity of their FISI or their FESC and the natural orientation towards close and meaningful relationships with people, and understand what people generally tend to do when they get hurt. And then combine that with a general understanding of fear. If ESTJs in their early life end up having this very idealistic FESC mindset and are really looking for that person who they can really bond with, who would get them on a deep level, maybe even to the extent of naivety, for example, this can also be someone who ends up getting really crushed and disappointed. Someone who ends up carrying a lot of pain and hurt within themselves, especially when you consider the fact that introverted feeling divergence isn't necessarily a position which is naturally well suited to being understood and being kind of changed and molded and adapted. So therefore the healing process of an ESTJ can be a little bit slower and more on the back burner than that of, for example, an INFP, who by contrast more kind of seizes the bull by the horns. So in essence, the FESC dip of the ESTJ really allows this type to form very deep connections with other people, and often kind of even very romantic in the way that they just talk about human connection in general. But if select ESTJs maybe get hurt a bit too much, for example, they could just find a kind of shutdown of that part of their mind. And it is quite tragic in those instances where that does occur. But when I'm talking about my own client base, the people I've interacted with professionally who I've typed as ESTJs, these types tend to be extremely sensitive people who are really looking to experience life and human connection on a deeper level than I would say a lot of people. It really does mean the world to them a lot of the time. But as I said in my ENFJ video, FESE, while it does seek depth of connection, it does not seek breadth of connection. So this goes back to point one when I talk about sociability as a form of extroversion. FESE is not intrinsically sociable on the broad kind of quantifiable scale. It's much more quality over quantity. So even when an ESTJ does have a very strong FESE dip, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be scoring high on sociability. And the main reason why I was looking forward to this FESE exploration within this type is essentially to do with their natural caretaking proclivity. Once an ESTJ forms a deep bond with someone, and I can talk about an ESTJ parent, for example, that's a great ubiquitous kind of representation. They will often find themselves going out of their way to attend to the needs of the other. Yeah, they wouldn't necessarily have the kind of FE divergent kind of tact and hesitancy in their communication style. But when it comes to kind of doing things for the other, the ESTJ will oftentimes find themselves in a serving role. This type is generally less of a no person and much more of a yes person. If someone they care about asks them to do something, they will generally not hesitate in order to devote a lot of time and resources to helping that person out. Te and E convergence, FESE, dipping from that position, FISI divergence, these kind of functions all create a network from which emerges a trait often to do with helping people, serving others, being of service, being of use. I don't talk about the Enneagram a lot on this channel. I've got my own reservations about the system, but Enneagram 2 I see a huge correlation between that and ESTJ cognition, which is really, really cool to think about because it very much turns the tables. It very much kind of flips the idea of an ESTJ on its head. When you see the tendency for this type to consistently serve others, to devote themselves to other people or to the world around them and take on lots of responsibilities to the extent of oftentimes causing burnout for some people, you'll actually see a huge connection between that concept and this concept. So definitely look more into that when you really want to understand this type in more depth. Before we wrap up, let's touch on a couple of bonus points that will help us explore this cognition in even more detail. First is the CPT conception of intuitive thinking over sensing thinking. So notice how the ESTJ has extroverted intuition connected to extroverted thinking. This essentially makes for an intuitive thinking process. And on the flip side, they have a sensing feeling process, SI, connected to FI. So while this type is often kind of like boxed into a stereotype of being very detail-oriented, facts first, etc., in real life, you'll oftentimes notice this intuitive thinker doesn't really like details and facts and stuff like that because their natural cognitive proclivity is towards a general conceptual high-level overview of what they're talking about and understanding rather than getting into the nitty-gritty details. When you're comparing an ENTJ, for example, to an ESTJ, you'll often find an ESTJ talking in a much more loose and oftentimes even mystical manner, whereas the sensing thinking of the ENTJ is going to be a lot more analytical and precise. So ESTJs often think in more intuitive ways. Oftentimes they have a more musical process as a kind of enacting lively orchestration upon the world around them. They generally prefer to stay at a high conceptual level. So there's no surprise then that this type would often mistype as an intuitive type. As many of you know, I kind of reject the MBTI dichotomy of sensing versus intuitive as a valid way of measuring types of people. There might be characteristics we have in the moment, and across a very large population, there might be a general tendency for one cognition to be more one than the other, but it won't be a big one. So ESTJs will often look at their own very intuitive, very nebulous a lot of the time thinking processes in a more musical approach to life over the analytical one of, say, the ENTJ. And quite rightly see themselves as more of an intuitive type. Furthermore, when accompanied with the kind of FISI sensitivity of feeling, that FESE synchronization with the world around them kind of modality, and the TENE ecosystemic drive, the intuitive thought process of the ESTJ often gives them a more spiritual slant to life than most. This is certainly not to say every ESTJ is going to be a spiritual person or anything of that nature, but oftentimes the way that they think naturally is highly spiritual. They often look for cyclicality, for example, life's general overarching patterns, the general laws of reality that may not be observed but are felt instead. Oftentimes, ESTJs will use such nodes of logic as a kind of north star to guide them. And this aids the type's oftentimes natural pursuit of depth of connection and synchronicity with life. And finally, there's the systemization that the type achieves from their TINI convergence dip, the ISTP side of their cognition. So when an ESTJ is orchestrating upon the world around them, they're oftentimes bringing things into a kind of synthesis, a natural cohesive whole. But as opposed to the ISTPs, who often have a more conceptual internal world, kind of simulating what might be in the future, the TINI of the ESTJ is oftentimes more activated through interaction with the world around them. Again, coming back to the idea of a reactive cognition over a proactive one. So for as long as the ESTJ is in their flow state, for example, for as long as they're kind of having this lively, perhaps even experimental engagement with the kind of mechanistic laws of the reality around them, they'll often be highly prone to just inventing things on the fly. They'll often find solutions to things that other people would not necessarily have thought of. This is a highly inventive and original type, for as long as they have meaningful things to engage with that sufficiently stimulate all of their brain. And this is the greatest point of irony. The whole mastermind stereotype, the idea, as often described by pages like 16 Personalities and stuff like that, of there being someone who just kind of takes things in their stride and just like whatever they come across, they end up kind of optimizing upon. They're just this kind of force of nature, improving every single thing that they come into contact with. This stereotype matches ESTJ cognition far more than it does that of the average INTJ. INTJ is another incredible type, but what if you're talking about someone who's more driven towards optimizing on the fly, kind of finding things easeful even as they kind of notice something isn't working properly and find an innovative solution in order to get it up to its potential. And that can even include people in this instance too. ESTJs are often amazing mentors. Again, we're talking about TE-NE convergence much more than we are NIFI convergence. So I would posit ESTJ as the true mastermind out of all the 16 types. And there are other mastermind-ish kind of types as well. There's the ENTJ, who's often incredibly adept at finding a desire and making it happen, oftentimes through force of will though. And the ENFJ, for example, who is another NI authority type, and is often incredibly adept at creating a kind of framework, step by step, in order to complete an objective. But oftentimes, whereas an ENFJ is a natural chess player, for example, thinking many moves ahead, they won't necessarily adapt on the fly when it doesn't go to plan. ENTJs, while they've got incredible willpower, and for as long as they're facing something, they can deal with it, they wouldn't necessarily be having that kind of chess mindset that an ENFJ would be. But if you look at an ESTJ, you have that kind of TE dominant trait, you have a side of ENFJ cognition, but you also have a TE-NE kind of adaptability. So you have the kind of best of both worlds there to create someone who definitely is going to be a force of nature, but they're going to be doing so in a highly systemized way and calculating the steps that it takes in order to get there. So it's worth bearing in mind the extent to which this type has mastermind-esque traits. Although, of course, I don't really believe anyone's a mastermind at the end of the day. So there you have it. I hope this video resonated with you, even if you may not necessarily be an ESTJ. The good thing about this kind of cognitive frameworking stuff is that it does talk about properties that humanity as a whole tends to share. Where type comes in is where these properties are particularly manifested over other ones, when there's a kind of cognitive preference for one thing over another, rather than a cognitive absence, which doesn't necessarily exist. And since this type is so often ignored, misrepresented, and overlooked, I wanted to give their cognition more justice in this video. So many more people would be open to being an ESTJ if the type wasn't so heavily demonized by this rather eclectic community. The reason why I've been saving this video in the series until last is because I really wanted to get it right. It's not to overlooking the cognition as much as it is really valuing it and really wanting to ensure I did it justice in this video. So if you know anyone who you think would benefit from this video, perhaps there's an ESTJ in their life, for example, or perhaps you suspect that they may be one, definitely share it with them. And if you would like to support the channel in a theory on that additional level, CPD is also on Patreon, and I'd really appreciate your support over there. But of course, I already massively appreciate your viewership over here, so thank you. So that's it for me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.